Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, maybe good evening for some of us. Really wonderful to see you all here. My name is Jesse Fripp. I'm the co-lead along with my esteemed colleague, Nelly Ramirez, who's also with us, of the Secretariat for the CFAR Alliance at BFA Global. CFAR being the Climate Innovation for Adaptation and Resilience Alliance, which focuses on acceleration of innovation and investment into the space around financial and technology innovations that support adaptation and resilience for the world's most vulnerable. Great to have you here with us today as part of our regular Brown Bag series. We're really delighted to welcome Sylvia and Wendy from CGAP, who were founding colleagues, or even pre-founding colleagues of the CFAR Alliance in 2021, and have been really extraordinary partners and contributors to the building of the knowledge and the action momentum that the Alliance is really focused on. So they'll be speaking today about insights on resilience and financial inclusion, which really is at the heart of what we're all really concerned about and hoping to learn more about and translate into action. So I think without further ado, unless Nelly, you have some other comments, or we can maybe talk a little bit at the end about some of the upcoming events of CFAR Alliance as we close out. So we will just jump right into it and pass off to Sylvia and Wendy to introduce yourselves and the topic and dig in. So thanks again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jesse, and hello, everyone. Lovely to meet you all here. And thanks also to the CFAR team for the opportunity to share our initial insights on our research around climate resilience and financial inclusion, and also what we are planning moving forward at CGAP. So we'll also be launching a poll. If you can go to Slido, and you have here also the code for the poll, also the QR code. We will leave that poll open, and this will be part of our discussion that we hope to have after the presentation, to look at what you see are the most important things that need to be done to improve the uptake and the usage of financial services that help the most vulnerable build climate resilience. So that would be part of our discussion later on. And this is open text, so just keep the comments coming, and we'll look back at those after the presentation. So I hope you all could take note of this, and I will move on then. Let me see. Yeah, my slides are moving again. I'll briefly introduce CGAP because I'm not sure amongst the participants how familiar you are with CGAP, and we'll also give a brief overview of the strategy. Here you can see these are CGAP's current members. It's over 35 multilateral and bilateral development agencies, also a couple of private foundations that are supporting CGAP and generating knowledge about effective and meaningful approaches to support inclusive finance and the power of inclusive finance in contributing to the global development goals. CGAP was created in the mid-90s, and since then our work and also our vision has evolved from an initial focus on microcredit to broadening the focus to a wider range of financial services. We added a focus on digital, and then in the past couple of years, it's really evolved to looking more specifically at like what's the role of financial inclusion in contributing to broader development goals. And very specifically now in our new strategy that we just launched in July, we are looking at financial ecosystems, so not only financial services, and how they can contribute to green, resilient, and inclusive development. And you see here also our vision for the next 5-year cycle of CGAP. With that new strategy, we also adjusted a bit our work program, also how people are being structured within CGAP. And so that structure has obviously the purpose to contribute to that vision of responsible, inclusive financial ecosystems that enable a green, resilient, and equitable world for all. The first three work areas are focusing on key outcomes for achieving that vision. So we have one work area around green development. So it's a contribution of finance to climate adaptation, mitigation, and a just transition. Then work around finance for resilient development, and then also work about finance for inclusive development. So really extending further financial services for the most vulnerable and the most excluded populations. Below that, we have work areas that we see are critical enablers. And the most important enabler to achieving those outcomes is that we increase the breadth and also the depth of financial inclusion. And that, again, is enabled and supported by an ecosystem, a financial ecosystem that is responsible. And so we need regulations and also policy approaches that support that. And on the other side, there's also an important role of investors. And particularly with the challenges ahead, we need to mobilize private capital. And so we have also a specific work stream looking at impact investing and how to increase that. And all this is also supported by a work stream that looks at generating and promoting more evidence generation for what works well and what are the key enablers for leveraging that power of financial inclusion and achieving this broader development outcome. With this, let me dive deeper into our specific work around climate resilience. And particularly over the past year, we have already started to do a more dedicated effort around understanding the role of financial inclusion in supporting climate adaptation and resilience of the most vulnerable. Before we do that, briefly about that work that we've done over the past year, we took quite a broad lens, and we looked at customers, we looked at providers, we looked at government, we also looked at funders, and across those, we looked also at the specific challenges that women experience in the context of climate change and in the access of financial services for climate adaptation, and also gender gaps. As a result of that research, we formulated an initial narrative that we will be presenting now to you. We produced a couple of internal papers that focus, that zoom into those specific stakeholder groups and what they are doing and what are the gaps there. That we can also share on a one-on-one basis. In addition to those internal papers, we've started developing and also publishing a couple of papers, and two of them are already published and more to come. We have also an overview later in the presentation. And we formulated a couple of learning agendas that came out of that work that we've been sharing also with external partners. But it has also really informed our work in CGAP 7 around green development, and we'll share a bit about that also later on. So before we dive in, I just want to clarify a couple of terms. I think within the CFA Alliance, we are quite aligned, but I just want to make sure with everybody on the call that we talk the same language here. There are two central terms in the climate space, as everybody knows, so mitigation and adaptation. Important to note is that mitigation is about mitigating global warming and reducing the further global warming. It's not about mitigating risks. Adaptation, on the other hand, is about us to learn how we can live with the warming that we've already created. So as I mentioned, for us, we decided that we do not even use risk mitigation in the context of talking about climate adaptation because it can lead to misunderstandings. Further to that, there's a lot of talk about green finance, and we realize that in the green finance, well, when people talk about green finance, they often don't distinguish between mitigation and adaptation, whilst we think that it's quite important that there's a better distinction and also understanding of what the differences are and how different financial approaches can contribute to either of them. So when we look at climate mitigation and adaptation, we've decided that we take a much stronger focus on adaptation, also because when we think about mitigation, the poor are not a problem. The poor have contributed very little, and they will continue to contribute very little to global emissions and to climate change. But they are bearing the brunt of the consequences of climate change. And so adaptation is really important when we talk about the poor. And that's why our focus is really on adaptation. So that's briefly ahead. Also, when we look at climate adaptation and the role of financial services, it's good to distinguish between planned adaptation and autonomous adaptation, which is used in the climate space specifically. Planned adaptation is the deliberate actions by policy and public actors, versus autonomous adaptation is about the spontaneous initiatives taken by individuals and by private actors. And financial inclusion plays a very important role for both of them. For planned adaptation, for example, recovery payments by a government, that they require accounts, they require KICO networks. But also for the autonomous adaptation, financial services play a key role for the adaptation strategies of individuals, because whatever they want to do to adapt, most of the times it involves some sort of savings, of lending, of remittances, and or insurance. And what we've also found in our research is that so far the focus has been really on planned adaptation when it comes to green finance or to financial services. And that's why we feel there's a real need to raise the attention of the power of inclusive finance to contribute to the autonomous adaptation that really empowers the poor to determine themselves how they want to adapt and what adaptation strategies they want to take. So that is just upfront. And with that, let me hand it over to Wendy to share what we found with these research agendas over the past year. Over to you, Wendy.
Thanks, Sylvia. Hi, everyone. My name's Wendy Chamberlain, and I'm a consultant working with CGAP. We wanted to share with you the outputs of research we did in what we call phase one of this work. Phase one was really a learning phase for CGAP. We recognize we are a newer entrant to the climate conversation. We really started digging deep into this topic in the fall of 2021. So we prioritize spending about 10 months learning as much as we can from different stakeholders who have been working on this topic from a variety of actors, with a specific desire to understand who's already doing work in this area, especially with a focus on financial inclusion and climate change, and where does it make sense for CGAP to participate in this conversation given the work that's already being done. That work included a lot of help and direction from partners. So we are fortunate to have partnered with FCDO, FSD Africa, Decotis, and Microsave as part of our research initiatives. We also had an advisory committee made up of subject matter experts from across the climate and financial inclusion sectors. And then we also took time to interview over 100+ financial institutions from across the spectrum, including banks, microfinance institutions, those sorts of entities that focus on informal financial services, those that focus specifically, let's say, on insurance delivery, just to ensure that we were getting a rounded view of this topic. And so when CGAP talks about phase 1, that's this learning phase that took place up until June of this year. And all of this information then informs the direction CGAP is going to take strategically as part of CGAP 8, which begins or has kicked off as of July of this year. So some of what we're going to share with you here, even the words on the screen, may not be surprising to you. And in fact, many people rightfully ask, what's new about climate change? Because most of the populations we're talking about are already exposed to these events. And so we'll talk a little bit about our insights on that. A few clarifications on verbiage. When we talk about the poor, when we talk about the vulnerable, when we talk about women, we are careful in our minds not to think about those as monolithic entities, and we recognize the need for segmentation within those groups. We also recognize the need to understand the important findings, I'd say geographically, about how people are impacted by climate shocks and stresses. How somebody is impacted by a drought in Nigeria is not going to be the same. The way somebody responds to that is going to be much different than how somebody responds to a cyclone in Bangladesh. And while of course that's obvious, so often in our sector, we are often looking for that one solution that can respond to a multiplicity of events. And honestly, this is kind of the challenge that we're seeing with climate shocks and stresses, is that they are really disrupting our singular intervention approach that we often gravitate towards. So just some high level insights that again may seem quite obvious, but just to note that climate shocks and stresses vary in their frequency, size, duration, and timing. They do not follow a tidy, orderly series of events as evidenced by the horrific events in Hawaii just last week, where we had an offshore hurricane that actually was a catalyst for terrible fires on land. These things are overlapping and causing one catastrophe after the other. We also recognize that these events are catalysts for other shocks and stresses, which can be equally significant. So when we think about flooding, we also have to think hand in hand about waterborne diseases that people may be exposed to, or the loss of income and therefore the inability households or individuals may have to pay for necessary goods and services. Climate impacts also have multi-sectoral implications. What this all means is that our worldview of thinking in sectoral silos is really going to be challenged, because how people experience these events cuts across sectoral domains. So we have to recognize these multi-sectoral implications as part of it. And that cuts across sectors from health to finance, but it also cuts across systems as well, thinking about the micro level, what happens at the individual level to the community level and the market level. We know from the research, from the conversations, we can look at this from the news, that those who are poor are most susceptible to climate shocks and stresses by virtue of where they live, by virtue of the resource they have access to in order to respond. And they often have the least good options to respond. Next slide, please, Sylvia. And again, going back to my previous statement, we're not talking about women as a monolith in our minds as we talk about it, but so please keep that in mind when you read these words. But we do see from the research that women face greater exposure. They are more vulnerable to climate shocks and stresses. We also see, perhaps not surprisingly, that they face the same barriers that we have been talking about in the financial inclusion sector for some time, in terms of uptake and usage of relevant financial services that can support their adaptation needs. And so when we think about the intersection of financial inclusion and climate, we need to see a deliberate effort that takes, I would say, more of an intersectional view on how women are impacted, especially by discrete climate shocks and stresses. And we'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. And there's several click-throughs here, Sylvia, so you can go ahead and move through them if you want. So as we mentioned, women have a higher degree of exposure, primarily due to the fact that women are more likely to work in agriculture. They're exposed to slow and rapid onset climate change. women and girls face greater vulnerability. This is due to an increase in unpaid labor and what we talk about in the world of time poverty, and greater demand on them. This can look like women having to go further to fetch water for household crops. Simultaneously, we are seeing an increased recognition in that women and girls face greater exposure to gender-based violence. This can occur within the household and outside of the household. This can look like a number of things, including early child marriage. And this is something that has to be recognized. And the other side of this is that there then is very little response mechanisms that support this in the form of healthcare that women and girls can access to respond. And then we see, based on these and what we've talked about before, that women have less access to the resources they need. One of the things that comes up time and time again in the literature and in the conversations and based on research we've done is that while there's such a push for innovation, say around climate smart agriculture and looking at adaptation models, what can be overlooked in the enthusiasm for or adaptation is the fact that gender norms and social norms play a prominent role, and those have to be addressed. So we have story after story of women who are precluded for participating in adaptation opportunities by virtue of gender and social norms for where they are. On any of these, we're happy to share insights or literature, by the way. When it comes to very climate responsive products, and I would say when we talk about that within CGAP, we are referring to those products that are responding to a climate shock or stress. But I will layer on that, we will also talk about attributes of products and services that respond to the wholesale experience of climate shocks and stresses. But when it comes to looking at what exists, what's there for women right now, we aren't finding really anything that is targeted towards them, with some exceptions. And so there is a need to recognize that we need to be more intentional in our design for products and services. And again, this is not a new conversation to the financial inclusion space, but in the climate change plus financial inclusion conversation, we need to make sure that we are thinking about this all the more. Next slide. So when we talk about financial inclusion and its intersection with climate resilience, for sure, there is a relationship to be built here, and there are opportunities. I think it's fair for us to look at both informal and formal financial services. And so there are tools available, but it's not an automatic win that financial services are going to solve all of the needs that people have as a result of exposure to climate shocks and stresses. And in fact, in some cases, and we'll go on to this a little bit more, the business case to convince providers to respond and provide relevant products and services is going to be a little bit harder, because we are talking about clients who are facing a higher degree of risk and exposure that those institutions may not be able to take on. As well, some of the products and services carry their own risks, and they can become problematic too. This is especially the case we see with loans, with also just broader financial literacy and the complexity that some of these products have embedded into them. Next slide. From our interviews with financial service providers, we found that there were some FSPs in a few countries who are out ahead, but for many, climate is not a top priority. I'll drop a few names. We did have, Sewa is one example, and by giving some names, I will probably likely exclude some others. Advanced Microfinance is also another entity worth looking at, who is thinking about this challenge more comprehensively. And these are some of the biggest issues that providers talk about is lack of data, both on what customers are experiencing and what they need. Honestly, a lack of capacity internally, and this is often due to competing demands strategically that these organizations have. The existing product landscape is pretty narrow. Most of it is centered on agricultural insurance, so weather-based index insurance, index-based livestock insurance, or some of the products many are familiar with. And many of the products that exist and what we see out there are more focused on green loans and portfolio quality, rather than what is it that people need in order to be resilient and to adapt to climate events. Next slide. And as I mentioned, the responses to climate change present some big challenges for financial institutions, which threatens the opportunity for financial inclusion. We're already talking about clients who are considered very risky and costly to reach due to where they are, due to the type of risks that they face, due to the limited collateral that they may have access to. And so FSPs may find it harder to serve these clients in specific geographies or value chains. FSPs themselves are vulnerable to climate shocks and stresses, either because of what happens to them when an event takes place, or to the sustained demand in a protracted crisis that they experience. And it may just be too much for them to try and serve these clients. We are also seeing an unintended consequence where financial service providers are incentivized to provide products and services to clients who are making a green or a just transition and taking on green livelihoods. Those clients may benefit from products and services. But if people have undertaken adaptation opportunities just to address gaps in their income, and yet those don't fall into those buckets of green or just transition, they may be precluded or excluded from receiving the benefits of those products and services. Next slide. At a broader level, in our conversations and the work other colleagues did in talking to standard setting bodies and talking with regulators, the risk that people are focusing on, that governments are focusing on, is on financial stability, not on the inclusion of or resilience of the poor. So we are seeing the financial inclusion conversation being relegated to the financial inclusion sector in the usual domains, but not into these bigger conversations around the consequences of climate shocks and stresses. We're not seeing this becoming a priority agenda as well for standard setting bodies. I would say also, and probably there are people on this call who have experience with this, funders are not discussing this or addressing these risks in their strategies, or it gets relegated to a specific part of their philanthropic strategy, but it is not cross-cutting. And so what we tend to see is an over-indexing towards a term we referred to at the beginning, focusing on green finance or broader climate mitigation rather than supporting climate adaptation. And there's more that needs to be done, obviously, then to build the capacity and to build the use case for why it matters to go in that direction. Next slide, please. And we do think government can do a role, partly because the demands and the needs are going to be so great that they can't be covered by markets. We can look at social protection programs as a viable channel for this, but with some research that we did on social protection programs and their capacity to respond, we have to make sure that we are cautious in ensuring that those programs have the infrastructure in place to actually deliver on their primary remit first before we layer on more Christmas tree ornaments, if you will. Sorry, I accidentally hit my mute button. And so examples of this are when we look at a specific location that may be susceptible to drought. For example, if we look at some research we did, we're looking at Sahel-based programs where we say, wow, there's people who are highly exposed to drought. There are people who are highly exposed to loss of income generating activities. Wouldn't it be great if these programs could respond? But conversely, when we looked at what was in the infrastructure of these programs, and are they even able to develop the core remit around government to person cash transfers and targeting the right population, there were gaps in that. And so when we ask these programs to take on all that much more, in some cases, we're asking them to leapfrog over core infrastructural elements that they haven't been able to put in place yet. So all to say, we see some really great examples of social protection programs being able to respond, but there has to be a foundational component that's addressed first. So our takeaways is we do think financial inclusion is as a topic area, and financial services can serve as a key enabler of climate adaptation for the poor. But there's a lot we don't know, and there's little work that is happening we think that climate change is poised to push financial inclusion back unless we can help both clients and providers better manage their climate risk. And I would say within these two, part of this also comes with a recognition of better understanding both the unique attributes of climate shocks and stresses and how people experience them, that they're not nice and tidy, that they are multi-sectoral, that they last over periods of time, and that not everybody is looking for one type of product to solve all of their challenges, and that we apply those attributes to the product design that we think will be most supportive of their needs. We think public funders will be critical as well, but they must learn to work across their internal silos. The same honestly could be said for private foundations, for any sort of funder in the space. And lastly, we think it's critical that women and the needs of women are a central focus of this topic, both because of the issues of compounding inequities and their increased exposure to resilience. So let me stop there. It's a lot of information. We are happy to share more. And in fact, in a few slides, we'll share with you some of the resources we've created around this. And we're keen to hear from you too. So I think in the next slide, we're going to be getting a chance to look at some of the responses to the poll. Is that right, Sylvia?
That's right. And I realized when I went myself to the poll that it wasn't launched. So that was me trying to use the API, the Slido API in the Microsoft PowerPoint presentation. It seems to not be working that way. But I asked everybody to respond to it in the chat. But in addition to that, I think we can also just talk about it openly. We are not that many participants. So I also offer people to just unmute. You might have some questions, some comments, and within that conversation, we can also address some answers to those questions, what it really takes to increase the usage and the uptake of financial services that help the most vulnerable build their resilience and adapt to climate change. So yeah, happy to have any comments, questions, or thoughts. And I see that Nelly and Alison already shared some thoughts, but please also speak up because we are a small group.
Alison, do you want to go first?
Sure.
Sure. Yeah, just expanding on what I wrote there, responding to the question of what's needed to increase uptake. In my experience, working in East Africa and the Caribbean on energy and water in emerging markets, often the quickest way to uptake and the greatest rates of adoption were driven by innovating within structures and behaviors and tools that people were already familiar with, right? So piggybacking as a technique, which is well understood throughout the market. I think with financial inclusion, this gets tricky, especially when you're trying to introduce something new, right? You can't always build on what's existing, and that's the hard part. But at the end of the day, I think it comes down to building trust, which is very time and resource intensive, and often is probably why we don't see a lot of private market entrants or private market participants staying for very long, which reminds me of your conclusion that like you need a lot of public finance, right? This is, if we're talking about financial services almost in the sense of a utility, is this a critical function that people need to engage in society? I think perhaps that's another route to go. I know microfinance emerged in the gap of public funding, but I guess in my journey, that's kind of where my experience is taking me at this point.
Yeah, very interesting comment. Nelly, do you want to go next?
Yeah, well, my comment was more on was like two questions. What financial services have you found out there, or any success stories that you found out there that you could share, particularly targeting women? And I saw the statement of climate change will reduce or impact negatively financial inclusion, but although I can intuitively like see that? Could you recommend any particular research on how that will play out, like how that will happen because of increased level of poverty, because there's lack of access, because there's no like they're not available? Where will that come from, particularly that it will diminish financial inclusion? So people currently financially included will stop being, is what I understand, as a consequence of climate change.
Yeah, I can talk to that point right away, and then between Wendy and I, we can share some of the success stories that we found in our research. So on that potential risk to have wider financial exclusion and excluding some of the people that are already included comes from the fact that those people are becoming even more risky to serve. And climate change is a huge risk for financial service providers that they need to manage. And so they will withdraw, first of all, from the areas and from the customers that are most exposed to climate risk. And we know that these are the poor and the most vulnerable. And so that is one part of the potential negative effects on financial inclusion. The other avenue how that can be intensified is by regulators' push to report and to assess and to report their climate exposure to climate risks. And as regulators are actually focusing on greening the financial sector and also better understanding the exposure of their financial sector to climate risks, they might actually have an effect on further excluding and further pushing financial service providers to withdraw from very risky customers and areas. And the same applies also for investors that are pushing with risk mitigation. They need to mitigate their risk. They also want to have reports, but on the other hand, they are pushing for green finance, but green finance is much more focused on mitigation projects. So when you look at those inclusion lists, like the lists that are then considered to apply for be eligible for a green loan that is supported by impact investors, these lists seldomly include all the different activities that the most vulnerable are doing in order to adapt. And the people that are the most vulnerable and poor often also don't have the means to demonstrate that their activities are actually falling under one of those criteria. They might not have the relevant certifications, they might not have the capacity to report respectively, and so they can't access that green funding. So there are different avenues that contribute to that potential risk of further exclusion, if that is now clearer.
Very clear, thank you.
I would just add too, from a practical standpoint, and this is where I think the financial inclusion sector has to be really careful. I think for some reason we are sort of treating this as a very new topic that people haven't been dealing with before. And so in some cases, we're applying older indicators of even what it means to be financially included or excluded. And that's why I put in the FSD Kenya report, where they're looking at this topic of financial health, because what we're seeing is more, I'd say, comprehensive exposure to risk. And we're getting a chance to now, with the way, some of these conversations on financial health have been going, to get a better understanding of what it means for people to benefit from these products and services. And so I think there will need to be a sort of a recognition within the financial inclusion sector that we think about, again, how are we going to measure inclusion, but also how do we do it in this context that we are in globally right now, where there is many places are experiencing inflation, devaluation of local currency, on top of experiencing shocks and stresses, on top of political turmoil, which is something we saw from COVID, where the exclusion rates did increase. And so that's what we're seeing with this sort of frequency of events happening, is that these risks are compounding and are happening with greater frequency, which sets the stage for a lack of appetite by some providers to not engage, but also just not know how to if they are compelled to do so. I see David's hand.
Hi, yeah, I want to be provocative. Surprise, surprise. I just wonder. I mean, I really, Wendy, Sylvia, I think you were going to give some sort of exemplars of how financial services are really relevant to improving climate resilience, because I want to sort of challenge whether we're asking the wrong question here that we've got up. The very sort of focusing on uptake and usage of financial services just takes us back to I think a problem that we have had in financial inclusion for a long while, despite protestations to the contrary, that we care just a little bit too much about the supply side and not quite enough about the demand and the impact. And I mean, I'm remaining to be convinced that financial services are really a great entry point to tackling climate resilience, and that I think that they could be a useful tool alongside other pieces. But unless we take a radically more embedded approach to it, we're just going to go the same old line. And the thing is that it's just very easy for us to get attracted back to thinking about, what do we do with financial service providers who need to confront the climate crisis? And so, yes, of course, it's, quite, I mean, I heartily endorse the point that the risks of what we see at the sort of more macro level, where it's all around sort of, what do we do about the green risk to portfolios and assets and stranded assets and all that sort of stuff. But still, ultimately, if our aim is to say, well, what are the tools that really can be impactful, do we not need to sort of get away from trying to ship more financial product, and rather think, what are the solutions, and then, how are the financing challenges going to be tackled? What sort, which providers could be part of that?
Wonderful, David. No, thank you for that comment and for that slightly provocative question. I'll go first and I'll let Wendy add to it. So I think it didn't come across as much, but we certainly find that it's not only about the financial services that you want to push out to people, but it is really about partnerships and about a combination of financial services plus data, about information about how can they adapt, the technologies that they need to adapt, access to possibly new skills, access to education and training, so that they can also be part of the transition and adopt new practices and practices that are more climate resilient, but also responsive. So it's certainly really about financial services plus. And probably you are right, that question focuses more on the financial services, but I think we really do have to have that conversation more about financial services and how can they be better linked to other services that are critically needed for people to know what they can do with that money, right? And that they can invest that money in adaptation activities that are efficient and also meaningful. And that's also where we found, for example, for funders and for investors, they need to break their silos. I think especially amongst the funder community, there's so much focus always on building an inclusive financial system or financial sector development without really talking to their colleagues. And there is also a need to break up those silos amongst the teams, to have more holistic approaches to work towards an outcome that might be something around climate adaptation and resilience. And they think together about what does it take within that ecosystem in which that person lives in to have access to the financial services that give them the financing to access then other solutions for their climate adaptation strategies. So I think it's very critical, and I appreciate you making that comment. Wendy, do you have any further comments?
I would agree. I think I would agree with what you're saying. I would agree too with this notion of we probably need a radical rethinking, because if we're honest with ourselves, We're asking bankers to take on solving for climate challenges. And that they may not be the ones best served to do that, when in fact, maybe we need, the people who are most impacted to be a part of that conversation. And that's actually some of the demand side research that we've been part of this year has been really less about tell us about how products and services are making your life better, but more about tell us about how you experience these events. What do you do when this happens? How do you describe it? What are your words for this? And therefore, what is it that you want to need? And there's going to be a need for more of that research, because frankly, what we're learning is people are not a monolith. Obviously, it's the most obvious statement of the conversation. And two, they don't all want and need the same thing. And they have different priorities for how they want to respond to these events because they're experiencing these events in different ways. That's a tough proposition for the financial sector to reckon with, to be honest, because what one product can that fit into? It can't. It has to then ask of the sector, how can you be more flexible and responsive and get closer to the customer? But I think we have to caution ourselves for asking the service providers to be the one to come up with the solution, which I think is going to be part of the way forward for CGAP, as well as in reframing this too, because it's just not, we've tried this before with solving for many inequities where we put different sectoral stakeholders forward as the one to address the challenge, and they're not necessarily the ones who are best placed to do that.
I think it was Nelly, you also asked about a couple of success stories. So we've done a broad scan of existing climate responsive financial services. Most of those services are really in the insurance sector. There are a couple more focused on lending, and very few that think beyond that or that frame it in a way and consider them as services that support climate adaptation. What we've seen as good examples, Wendy already mentioned Sewa. They are also very focused on designing products that work for their customers, and I assume many of you are also familiar with them. So they are really success stories, and we're actually currently developing a couple of videos with customers from Sewa that share their experience with the product and how it has helped them in responding quicker after and recovering quicker after a shock. And similarly, we have also seen positive experiences from Pioneer Insurance, particularly in the insurance space. We know that also Blue Marble are working on a very interesting insurance product that they are currently piloting. There are a couple of interesting examples, and we can also give you, again, a link to our research on some of the climate responsive financial services that we've seen. And I know also CFAR has identified quite a few great examples, right? So there's another resource. But that being said, many examples are either not yet sufficiently haven't been launched for sufficient time, haven't been scaled sufficiently to really see, will they be working long term? Is there a clear business case? Because many of them are still based on support from public agencies, public funders. And so we feel like there's more need to really identify what are the services that make a big difference. There needs to be more research about the real impact that they are having, and what are also the business models that make it viable to provide those services long term without public support.
That was exactly the direction where my question was going. Is there any research that has actually assessed the impact of these financial services that address or that are more tailored or more focused? Because we have a list of, as you know, you're part of the Climate Smart Innovation Hub and the Gallery of Products we've collaboratively put together. We have a list of a lot of products that we found out there, and there's a lot of value proposition in the nexus of climate finance, but there is very little in terms of impact and what particular problem it solves, and to what particular segment of a vulnerable population. That's always like Wendy has mentioned, put all in the same, if it was all monolithic or the same. But yeah, thank you for
Part of that problem is also that there is not yet agreed upon set of indicators, right? Like, how do we measure resilience? And it's also very difficult to identify indicators that are relatively straightforward to measure. And we all know, particularly the funders that are supporting that, they have very little budget for huge impact assessment studies, right? So, and they want to have that impact ideally after 2 years, if not quicker, right? And so that is also not realistic. So we feel that also within the funder community, this needs to be a rethink about how they contribute and report on impact, and that there needs to be a much longer term thinking, and with that an approach to measuring and to measuring impact longer term, and being just much more like meaningful in terms of the indicators that are being selected. We actually have also an activity around measuring resilience, and particularly in the financial inclusion space. So that is another activity within CGAP. And given the time, maybe I briefly move on with like sharing where we are moving next, and where we are now working on different aspects of contributing to that learning agenda around financial services for climate adaptation. So based on the research, as Wendy mentioned at the beginning, we identified 8 learning agendas that we have been sharing with the sector, but also internally for consideration of our new strategy that we just launched now. And they are really around those key insights that we've had. So around what are good practices for financial service providers, and also for clients to become more resilient, the need to identify like a good risk management suite for women. So it does not only include the financial services, but also the other services and solutions that are enabled through financial services. Very importantly, as I mentioned right now, defining and measuring climate resilience. We need to look at like what are scalable financial products for climate resilience. The role of payments is also an interesting area to further explore, and enabling remittances and what role they play. As Wendy mentioned, we also had an effort around social protection payments, and so we saw a learning agenda also around how to leverage social protection schemes for building climate resilience, and not only in response to a shock, but also in preparation of shocks. There is a learning agenda around risk management solutions framework, and then that topic that we also discussed just now about the unintentional effects of greening the financial sector. So amongst those learning agendas, we actually took most of them on now in new work streams within CGAP 7. The first 3 here on the slide are all now embedded in the climate resilience project moving forward. So that looks specifically at what can financial service providers do better to manage climate risk, but also provide climate responsive financial services. One work stream that I will be leading, which looks at like what is the complementary role of public and private funding and also delivery in enabling access to climate responsive financial services. And then we have also a work stream that then purely looks at the public sector and at social protection schemes. We have a separate project on resilient rural women in climate smart digital economy, so very much focused on women, and Jamie Anderson is leading that, who many of you might know. We have a project also on carbon markets, which is led by Max Mattern. We have a work on policy responses, so that specifically looks at what can policymakers, regulators do to not forget about financial inclusion when they seek to green the financial sector. That is led by Marjorie Malve. And then we have also work around evidence and measurement of climate resilience, which will be embedded in a project that largely looks at creating more evidence around the role of financial inclusion, and that is led by Karina and Nelson. Her last name just escaped me. Yeah. So we are happy to connect with all of you on those topics and for those projects. And please just reach out to me or to any other CGAP colleagues, and we can connect you then with the respective project leads. This is an overview of the publications so far and the publications that are in the pipeline, as well as a couple of blogs that summarize some of those learnings that we shared today. We'll be sharing the slides also, so you should have access to that. And with that, I'll end our presentation, and yeah, we'll really be happy to stay connected with you. And if there are any questions, you can also connect with my colleague Lucy, who's, I think, on the call, and her email address is also down below. So I see we have 1 minute left. If there's still an urgent question or comment, please go ahead. Or maybe, Nelly, you want to take the time to share with the audience some more about the upcoming events from CFAR. So thanks, everyone.
No, thank you. Really, just to well, Jesse, you wanted to say something? Oh, just thank you, and Wendy, this was amazing. It's going to be uploaded in our YouTube channel, and we're going to share with everyone who registered, and also within the CFAR community. So you're going to be seeing this recording in the near future, and I think this was tremendously informative and interesting. So thank you both, always learning from you. And we have other brown bags. Hopefully CGAP will want to lead another one in the future. We have brown bags every month, every Thursday or Friday of every month, and the next one is actually tomorrow on carbon finance. And we'll be talking about how carbon markets can be more transparent, and how to know if what you're buying is the real thing. So it's tomorrow, 9 a.m. East. And if interested, just ping me a message or going to the CFAR webpage in LinkedIn that I will put right now in the link. And then next Friday, and September 1st, we have another carbon finance brown bag, because it's a learning series. So it's going to be 3 or 4 of them in the next month on the road to COP. So thank you again. And also we have our gender roundtable in October that Wendy will be leading. So very excited about that. And we'll also send to all of you an invitation. So with that,
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.